Sam Thompson had spent his entire life in near voluntary isolation. After 40 years as an electrician, he retired to his farm in the Indiana mountains, where his only constant companion was his orange cat, Toby. Since Helen, his wife, had passed away, he had practically closed off the room they shared, as if keeping it locked was a way to preserve the memories held within. Sam believed that by keeping that room untouched, his wife's memories would remain alive, protected from the passage of time. It was late October when the first strange thing happened. The weather was starting to cool down, and Sam loved the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot during his evening walks. That night, while Toby walked a few steps ahead of him, Sam glanced at the master bedroom window, the one he had long decided never to open again. It was only for a second, but he was sure he saw a shadow move behind the dusty glass. Sam stopped. His heart raced as if someone had ignited a spark within him. Imagination, he murmured to himself, dismissing the possibility that someone was really there. After all, he was alone, and that house hadn't seen another visitor in years. But the idea of an intruder invading his personal space made him shudder. He decided to ignore what he saw and went inside. Still, that disturbing vision haunted him, lingering over him like a dark cloud as he prepared for bed. Toby, curious as always, kept staring at Helen's bedroom door, meowing softly and restlessly. The next morning, Sam tried to shake off the uneasy feeling with his daily activities, but when he returned to the kitchen after a brief nap, he noticed the lights, which he always turned off, were inexplicably on. He frowned, wondering if he was becoming forgetful, but something inside him knew this was more than a simple memory lapse. On the third night, unease turned to pure fear. It was near midnight when he heard soft footsteps, as if someone was moving upstairs. Sam froze for a moment, holding his breath, trying to listen closely. The footsteps approached Helen's room, and for a moment he thought he heard a faint voice whispering his name. Without thinking, he grabbed his flashlight and crept up the stairs, each step echoing through the empty hallway. When he opened the bedroom door, the flashlight revealed a strange and disturbing scene. Helen's clothes were scattered across the floor, as if they had been pulled from the closet and deliberately tossed there. Sam felt a chill run down his spine, and before he could react, he noticed a shadow in the corner of the room. Sam froze, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The shadow in the corner looked dense, like a dark block of something that shouldn't be there. He blinked, hoping it was just an illusion of the dim light, but the figure didn't dissipate. And then, as if it had a life of its own, the shadow moved, silently floating toward the door. That's when Sam noticed something even more unsettling. The figure appeared to be wearing something familiar. Helen's robe, the same one she wore every winter morning, faded and patched. Toby, his faithful cat, was at the door, meowing and backing away, wide-eyed and fur bristling, as if he too saw what Sam was seeing. "Who's there?" Sam shouted, his voice echoing through the empty house. There was no answer, but the presence dissolved, leaving the air heavy and cold. He took a deep breath and tried to calm himself, but the sight of Helen's robe left him deeply disturbed, a reminder of what he had chosen to forget. In the following days, Toby's behavior grew strange. The cat, who had always slept peacefully on the sofa, now avoided the living room, preferring to hide under the bed or slink from room to room with a constant, nervous energy. Sam knew that animals sense things, and it only heightened his sense of impending threat. The following week, things escalated in a terrifying way. Sam woke in the middle of the night to the sound of doors slamming, as if a storm was tearing through the house. But when he looked out the window, there was no wind. Toby was huddled at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed on the bedroom door. Sam grabbed the flashlight once again, determined to uncover what was happening. As he descended the stairs, he noticed something even more sinister. On the wall of the living room, a phrase was scrawled, as if scratched by nails or some sharp object. "You promised." Sam felt his body go cold. That phrase brought back an old event, something he had avoided remembering. Shortly before Helen passed away, he had promised never to leave her alone. vowed never to abandon her, in life or in death. But as time went on, Sam had withdrawn into himself, ignoring his wife's memory and locking himself in his own solitude. The phrase left him devastated and uneasy, but he refused to believe it was the work of a spirit. He decided that someone was playing a prank, some bored neighbor perhaps trying to scare him. But that same night, a low, persistent sound woke Sam. It was like the whisper of a familiar voice, yet ethereal, calling out to him. "Helen," he murmured, barely realizing it. His heart raced and the air felt thin around him, as if something or someone was sharing the space with him. And then, something unthinkable happened. The lights began to flicker. Amid the flashes, he saw the figure of a woman, indistinct but with familiar features. It was Helen, or at least it seemed to be Helen, but her face was distorted, as if she were trapped between two realities. Her eyes, once full of life, now looked like dark, empty voids. "You abandoned me, Sam," the figure whispered, her voice dark and filled with sorrow. He backed away, feeling despair take hold. I tried, Helen. I swear I tried," Sam replied, struggling to understand if this was real, or if he was finally losing his sanity. "You don't understand. I just couldn't go back into that room." The apparition of Helen moved closer, her feet not touching the floor. Sam dropped to his knees, the flashlight slipping from his hand as he watched the entity approach. He began to feel a heavy pressure in his chest, as if the air was being sucked out of his lungs. "You promised," the voice boomed, deafening, seeming to come from every direction at once. Sam tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the silence of the house. He closed his eyes, hoping it was all a nightmare, something he could push away. But when he opened his eyes again, the house was completely dark. There was no sign of Helen nor the message on the wall. The next morning, just after dawn, a neighbor decided to visit Sam's house. He found the door ajar, a cold breeze cutting through the air. Entering, he called for Sam a few times but received no answer. The farm was silent except for the low, repetitive sound of Toby's meow coming from upstairs. It was in the master bedroom that the neighbor found Sam, kneeling beside the bed, his eyes open and frozen in an expression of pure terror. He clutched a piece of Helen's robe tightly to his chest. Toby was beside him, staring fixedly at the dark corner of the room. Later, the coroner determined that Sam had suffered a massive heart attack. However, what the coroner couldn't explain were the deep scratch marks on the walls around him, where a single word was etched: promise. Jack Everett was the kind of guy who got along with the night. As a delivery driver, he spent hours driving down empty, silent roads, something most people would find tiring, but he found almost peaceful. It was a particularly cold October night, already past 2 in the morning, and Jack felt exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. He just wanted to grab a quick bite and head home. As he drove down a rural road on the outskirts of Austin, he spotted an open McDonald's. He pulled into the drive-thru, placed his order, and while waiting for his food, his eyes drifted to an old, dented Ford parked near the fence of the parking lot. The car's body was scratched and rusty, and its windows were covered by a dark tint that made it impossible to see who was inside. A chill ran down his spine. He shook his head, trying to brush off the feeling, grabbed his order, and drove away from the restaurant. Not wanting to face his empty home, he decided to take a detour and parked at a nature reserve a few minutes away, a quiet place he frequented when he wanted to relax. As soon as he turned off the engine, he saw headlights flashing in the distance. The Ford. It had followed him. "What the hell?" he muttered, his sense of unease growing. Feeling increasingly uneasy, Jack picked up his phone and called his friend Luke, who lived nearby. He didn't want to sound paranoid, but he knew Luke would understand. "Hey man, I'm at the reserve and there's a weird car that showed up here too. The same one I saw at the drive-thru. Can you come over for a bit?" Luke, who knew Jack well enough not to doubt him, agreed to meet him in a few minutes. While he waited, Jack kept an eye on the Ford, still parked a few yards away, engine off, with no sign of movement inside. The reserve's silence grew heavier by the second, and he felt a constant urge to start the engine and get out of there. But his curiosity kept him rooted. 5 minutes later, Luke pulled up beside Jack, and the two exchanged a nervous glance. His friend's presence helped ease the tension, but the Ford remained stationary and ominous in the distance. "What kind of people just sit like that at this hour?" Luke asked, frowning, also uncomfortable with the situation. "I saw that car at McDonald's earlier. Nobody got out of it, but it followed me here." "Something's not right," Jack replied, still watching the car. They both decided to walk up to the reserve's overlook, a spot with a wide view and better lighting. But as they climbed the trail, footsteps and low laughter echoed through the night. Luke and Jack froze, eyes widening as three men approached them on the trail, their smiles strange, and their demeanor far too casual for that time of night. "You two lost?" one of the men asked in a deep voice with a smile that seemed more menacing than friendly. Jack exchanged a quick look with Luke, feeling the tension rise. Jack answered curtly, "We're just taking a walk." "But what about you? What were you doing at McDonald's?" The man raised his eyebrows, surprised. And it was at that moment Jack remembered. He was sure there had been a fourth person in the Ford. But now there were only three. Jack's eyes scanned the shadows around them, searching for signs of the fourth man. He'd had a quick glimpse in the drive-through parking lot and could swear he'd seen 4 silhouettes. Where was the other one? One of the three men, tall and thin, wearing a dirty, worn-out coat, lit a cigarette and took a long drag, blowing the smoke in Jack and Luke's direction. "You guys seem nervous. Everything okay here?" he said, his tone still filled with fake hospitality. Jack felt the tension build and took a step back, exchanging a quick glance with Luke. "We're good. Just out for a walk. Maybe we should head back to the cars, huh?" Jack said, trying to sound casual, but the nervousness in his voice was evident. That skeletal man, who seemed like the leader, tilted his head, his eyes fixed on Jack. "Funny. Nobody comes here at this hour." He took another drag from his cigarette, his dark eyes watching their every move. "You know, we were just resting. Sometimes you just want peace without anyone bothering you." Luke, sensing the tension between Jack and the stranger, intervened. No problem. We'll leave you guys alone." But before they could turn around, the man blocked their path, now joined by the other two. "Leaving already? That's too bad. You seem like good guys. I was going to invite you for a drink. And after all, you haven't even met Fred," he said, pointing behind them. Jack froze, heart racing. He and Luke turned slowly, and there, at the edge of the trail, a few yards away, was the fourth man. He was shorter, with slouched shoulders and an almost hysterical smile on his face. His eyes looked darker than the others, with a kind of emptiness that sent chills down their spines. "Hey, Fred," Jack muttered, trying to keep the fear out of his voice. Fred just nodded, his eyes fixed on Jack. "Do we know each other? I feel like you saw me somewhere." Jack felt a lump in his throat. "I saw you at the drive-thru. You guys were at McDonald's, right?" Fred's smile widened, but his eyes grew even more distant, almost lifeless. "Is that so? Funny. I don't remember us going anywhere." The tension mounted to the point of becoming unbearable. Jack and Luke knew they were surrounded. The trail was narrow, with dense forest on both sides. They had nowhere to run except toward the cliff edge leading to the overlook. "You're scaring us," Luke said, his voice trembling in a way he couldn't hide. The tall man let out a slow, rough laugh. "That's the fun part, my friend. Sometimes you just need a little excitement. And, you see, we don't get many visitors around here." Without waiting another second, Jack grabbed Luke's arm and pulled him toward the overlook, running in that direction. The three men yelled and laughed behind them, their heavy footsteps pounding the dry earth as they gave chase. Jack and Luke ran with all their might, breathless and desperate, but the sound of footsteps seemed to get closer. Finally, they reached the overlook, a circular area where the trail ended, and looked down. There was nowhere to escape except for a drop of dozens of feet. Luke looked around frantically while Jack pulled out his phone, desperately trying to dial 911. But before he could complete the call, the three men appeared at the trail's edge, blocking their escape. The leader looked at them with a satisfied smile. "You ran quite a bit. Bet you're feeling the adrenaline now, huh? Let's play a little more." But then the sound of a siren echoed in the distance, and the man's smile vanished. He made a swift gesture to the others, who quickly retreated toward the trail, running back into the forest. Jack and Luke breathed a sigh of relief, hardly believing their luck. Within 2 minutes, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot near the trail entrance. An officer, holding a powerful flashlight, spotted them and approached. "What are you guys doing here at this hour?" he asked, frowning. They explained the situation between breaths, still in shock, but the officer just shook his head, skeptical. "The reserve closes at night, you know that?" he asked, looking around suspiciously. Jack looked at Luke, confused. How could they have gotten in if it was closed? "But how did those guys get here then? They were chasing us," Jack argued, but the officer just sighed. "You're lucky you're okay," he said. "A lot of people come here and end up disappearing." Jack and Luke looked at each other, pale. The officer escorted them back to the parking lot, but by the time they arrived, the old battered Ford had vanished. Jack never went back to that reserve again. Maplewood was the kind of town that seemed forgotten in time. Hills covered in trees, old brick houses, and streets that creaked under the weight of days gone by. For Jason and his friends, nights there were long and monotonous, especially during the fall. Ever since they started high school, exploring abandoned buildings had become their only exciting pastime, and the church on Maplewood Avenue was one of their favorite destinations. On a cold and cloudy October night, Jason and his group of friends, Melissa, Andy, Sarah, Noah, and Lucy, decided to revisit the abandoned church. They said the place had been vacant for decades, ever since a fire almost destroyed it. Soot-stained walls, broken windows, and the partially collapsed tower told the grim story of that place. It was nearly midnight when they jumped over the rusty fence and snuck in through a broken side window. Jason was the first to enter, followed by Andy and Melissa, while Noah helped Sarah and Lucy climb through the window. The air inside the church was heavy and smelled of mold, as if the dust there had never been disturbed. "This place always seems worse each time we come back," Melissa murmured, adjusting her flashlight and illuminating the space around them. The wooden beams of the ceiling looked more fragile than ever, tilted as if they could collapse on them at any moment. "This should be the last time we do this, guys," Noah suggested, but no one responded. They went straight to the basement, the place that always drew them in. The metal stairs creaked with every step as they descended, and the echo of their footsteps spread across the damp walls. It was a raw cement basement, divided into small rooms that had likely once been storage rooms or confessionals. When they reached the larger room, Jason shone his flashlight on a dusty, cracked mirror leaning against one of the walls. Next to it was an old wooden dresser with a frame holding a picture of a young woman in a wedding dress. Her face was faded, but something about that image made him uneasy. "Who leaves something like this here?" Sarah murmured, staring intently at the portrait. Jason stepped forward to examine the mirror. He noticed the cracks formed a strange pattern, almost as if someone had deliberately traced lines on the grimy surface. Dust and dirt concealed faded red marks he chose not to investigate closely. Suddenly a loud bang echoed from the other side of the basement. They all froze. "What was that?" Lucy whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Maybe the wind," Andy replied, but his voice betrayed his insecurity. They knew that, buried under so much concrete, there was no wind strong enough to move the doors like that. Without much thought, Sarah, Noah, and Melissa ran to the stairs, while Jason, Lucy, and Andy decided to check what had caused the noise. They walked toward a door at the back, which appeared to be slightly ajar. Jason felt a chill as he slowly pushed the door open. Behind it, they found a small dark room with no furniture, only cold, damp walls, and the sound of footsteps that seemed to come from all directions. Jason held his breath as the sound of footsteps echoed around them. There was no one else in the small room but the three of them, yet the sound persisted, as if someone were walking just behind them, in the shadows, at an almost imperceptible distance. Andy's flashlight lit up the empty walls, but the beam seemed incapable of penetrating the deeper darkness that filled the corners of the room. This isn't normal," Lucy whispered, clutching Jason's arm. Her eyes were fixed on a spot on the wall where there appeared to be a recent mark, like a deep scratch made with something sharp. Without responding, Jason took a step back, feeling panic rise. And then he noticed something even more disturbing. A shadow moved quickly in the cracked mirror passing behind them, but when he turned, there was nothing there, just their pale, frightened reflections. "Let's get out of here now," Andy said, his voice low and urgent. He didn't need to repeat himself. Jason and Lucy agreed immediately, and the three began moving toward the door. But before they could leave, they heard the unmistakable sound of a low, guttural laugh coming from somewhere near them. Without a second thought, they bolted out of the room and dashed up the rusty stairs, not caring about the sound of their footsteps echoing through the empty church. Their panic was so intense that they barely noticed when they stumbled over debris and nearly lost their balance. The laughter continued to follow them, as if something invisible was climbing right behind. They reached the main floor, where Sarah, Noah, and Melissa were waiting, with equally terrified expressions. "What happened?" Sarah asked. But before Jason could answer, a deafening crash echoed throughout the entire church. It was as if all the doors and windows were being forced at once. The sound enveloped them, and the entire structure seemed to shake. They all screamed in unison and then started running for the exit. But as they ran, Jason risked a final glance back. And that's when he saw it. In the dark corner of the church, among the fallen beams and shadows, stood a figure. It wasn't an ordinary person. The silhouette looked like a distorted version of a woman, tall, too thin, with elongated limbs and a dress that seemed almost fused to her skin, faded and old like the surroundings. She had her face partially covered by a sort of veil, but beneath it Jason could see something unsettling. Empty eyes and a frozen smile, as if she were trapped in a macabre expression of contentment. Before he could process what he was seeing, the figure moved, advancing toward him with unnatural speed. Survival instinct took over, and he turned, running faster than he ever thought possible. Upon reaching the broken window, Jason practically threw himself outside, feeling the cold night air on his face. One by one, his friends also made it out, all in a panic. Only when everyone was outside did they manage to breathe a sigh of relief, though fear still clung to each of them. But before they walked away, Jason cast a final glance back at the church. The figure was there, standing in the window, watching them. And around her, small shadows moved, as if other dark, unknown eyes were also watching them. The group ran, crossing the fence and fleeing the church as fast as they could. No one looked back or exchanged a word during the run. Only when they were several blocks away did they begin to slow down. Finally, breathless and silent, they reached the local park. They sat on a bench, staying there quietly, trying to process what they had seen. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "What was that? Did you all see her?" They all nodded, still in shock. In the days that followed, none of them could forget the night at the Maplewood Church. Jason researched as much as he could about the church, but found nothing about the fire or any reports of a female figure. However, a week later, he received a message from Noah. "I found something strange," the message read. Attached was a photo of an old article. It was a faded and aged newspaper clipping, with a picture of the church when it was still active. Below it, a caption revealed that a woman, the pastor's wife, had died in the church in 1954. The article described how she had locked herself in the basement, where she took her own life after losing her sanity. They said her spirit never rested. Jason felt a chill as he read. They had encountered the figure, the one who had never rested, and he knew deep down that something had been following them since that night, something that might not leave them in peace. A few weeks later, Jason woke up in the middle of the night. He felt a strange weight on his chest, as if something invisible was suffocating him. When he opened his eyes, he glimpsed the same macabre face of the church figure standing beside his bed, with empty eyes and a dark smile.